One day last week, I had dinner with the Grahal family. Tara, Randy, and their two children, Mason and Lucy. They're members of the church. They live just up the road over the line into Boxford. And, we just were catching up and talking about how things are going with them. And Randy told me something that he had just done that evening. He teaches fourth grade at a school in Chelsea, and he stays after school a couple of days a week to work with the kids there. A lot of the families come from families that have immigrated to this country from places like El Salvador, Honduras, Puerto Rico, Somalia, Brazil, and Nepal. So he stays after school to do activities with the kids, in particular to talk to them about things that are happening in their community or our country, to help them get acclimated. And so just the other day they were talking about Martin Luther King Day and why we recognize it nationally. And so it got me, thinking, what would I say to a kid if I were the person staying after school with them? And I thought that I would describe Martin Luther King as a modern-day prophet because he spoke hard truths with love and passion, and he was committed to nonviolent action for the sake of the freedom of all people to live and work without fear of judgment or violence. But I think he was a bit unusual as prophets go because he was groomed from a young age to be a minister and a teacher, and he was well known and respected in his community, and he lived in the mainstream of society, and he was very highly educated and well-traveled. And the prophets of old, the biblical prophets like Isaiah, were very different. They were often part of the fringes of society. They were not well known. And in fact, as Walter Brueggemann, one of the most prominent biblical scholars alive today, describes them, they were completely uncredentialed and without pedigree. So that's the sermon title, Completely Uncredentialed and Without Pedigree. Because prophets were most often persecuted and rejected and sometimes threatened with or received physical violence against them. So it makes me wonder, who are the voices that are completely uncredentialed and without pedigree that we may be failing to hear right now? Are there any among the new class of senators and congresspeople in Washington? Seems unlikely since most of them have degrees and connections, but maybe. Are they the students from Marjorie Stoneham Douglas High School in Florida, or the families from Sandy Hook? Are they the voices of one side or the other or both about the question of abortion? Are the words of the prophets written on the subway walls and the tenement halls like Paul Simon sings about? Are they whispered in the sounds of silence? The amazing thing about prophets, whether of old or modern day, is that the words they speak rise above any specific issue, because the most important thing, the thing that God cares the most about, is the way we treat each other. The words of the prophets call us to be accountable to each other. That's why it's so hard to hear them. They require us to set aside the issues and focus instead on fellow children of God, whether they're your next-door neighbor or your estranged sister or your grumpy father-in-law or the person sitting right next to you in the pew today. I chose the entire chapter of Isaiah 58 today because on this weekend, when we honor and remember Dr. King, a person obviously who was murdered for the prophetic words that he spoke and the idea of unity that he worked to spread around our country and the world, I thought it'd be good for us to look closely at the words of one of our scripture's most familiar prophets. The book of Isaiah is very long, and not all of it is believed to be written by Isaiah. The end of the book, including this chapter, was likely the work of several different writers. Their words addressed the people of Israel who were returning from Babylon to rebuild their great city and reaffirm their culture. Isaiah spoke from the edges then of a destroyed city to a dispersed people who had hard work ahead of them and needed to make a choice to commit to what was required of them. Either work together as a team through what would undoubtedly be a long and difficult road back, or dissolve into chaos of false power structures, egos, and quid pro quo. The words of the prophets are a warning, to be sure, but they can also be an invitation to respond to God, to that call God makes upon each of us to participate in God's own life by offering our own. My brother-in-law, Ronaldo Cruz, works with an organization called Emerge in New Haven, Connecticut, and that is a reentry and life skills program for formerly incarcerated people under the direction of a man named Dan Justino is his name, who is himself a formerly incarcerated person. Dan is a voice in the wilderness, offering bits of prophetic wisdom along the way, like, there's no right way to do a wrong thing. Or, when your intent is correct, God helps out. And perhaps most powerfully, letting go is an act. Forgiveness is a culture. Prophets surround us. Dr. King, Bishop Tutu, Mary Oliver, who I'm sad to say died last Thursday, if you didn't know, Wendell Berry, those kids in Parkland, Florida, Dan Justino of New Haven, and Isaiah. They call us to do things differently. And there's the rub. So much of what we do is out of habit, comfort, or safety. Breaking even the most mundane of routines can have a significant effect on us, let alone stepping out to try something really scary or totally new. We celebrated Epiphany a few weeks ago, which is a time that we mark and remember instances of illumination. So I want to offer you a story to illustrate clearly how a small change can be transformative. This is a story that was recorded by Mary Luty, who is a UCC minister who has served around New England. And she recorded this story. A parishioner confronted her pastor about the foot washing ritual in their Maundy Thursday service. She hated it, and she wanted it gone. It's so out of date, she informed him. We don't wear sandals every day, and our feet don't get dirty like in Jesus' time. I mean, apparently she never distributed clean socks to homeless people. When she said our feet, she meant the clean, healthy feet of people like her. Besides, she said, it's unhygienic, awkward, servile, and embarrassing. Right, he said. Your point? She stared at him. Well, all I know is no one's touching my feet. But she surprised him, and maybe herself, because she showed up, got her feet washed, and washed other people's feet too. And later, she confessed she'd cried when an Ancient of Days member of the church creakily knelt to dry the feet of his ailing wife. She also confessed that she gotten a pedicure earlier that day. I guess foot washing is less objectionable when your feet look good. But I'm not knocking her. It wasn't a small thing for her to allow even beautifully lacquered toes to be handled by Jesus. Even a faint light is a light. Even a slight unveiling can illumine the world. Yes, it was something, her little embrace of the distinguishing mark of a disciple, her beginner's insight into the inescapable paradox of the Christian faith, that down is glory and lowliness joy. Learning the upside downness of God's call by doing things that make us downright uncomfortable That's what living by faith is all about. It's what the prophets try so hard to help us understand. Are we willing to look at the ways we do things now and consider alternatives? Can we trust in God enough to allow the divine creativity in every one of us to let loose on our own lives and see where it leads? The first few verses of the 58th chapter of Isaiah seem just as accurate a description of where we are now as apparently they must have been 700 years before Christ when Isaiah lived. We are indeed busy at worship and studying about God. We do appear to be right-living, law-abiding, God-honoring people. But they also complain, as Isaiah wrote. I can't speak to your complaints. I think that's between you and God. I suspect that the folks who have the biggest beef with God probably don't come to church much. So I may be preaching to the choir in that respect, but I imagine you wouldn't have to think too long before you could identify a time in your own life when you questioned whether God was present or when you took issue with God about some happening. The next section of Isaiah's chapter 58 sounds pretty critical. God's judgment is that we're only going through the motions of the ritual of fasting and that we actually have ulterior motives for our behavior. We're missing the point of rituals which we practice. Fasting becomes something our ego takes pride in instead of an exercise in humility. I wonder if we substituted other words, would the sentence still make sense? Like, donating our time becomes something our ego takes pride in instead of an exercise in humility. Or making a pledge to the church becomes something our ego takes pride in instead of an exercise in humility. Or expecting an apology becomes something our ego takes pride in instead of an exercise in humility. But I suspect we are all rather experienced at judging ourselves harshly, since we are often our own worst critics. So I don't think I need to spend much time pointing out that there are places in our lives where we know we could do better, places where we suspect that God would not be pleased with our behavior towards others, towards those we love in our families, those we worship and work with in our church, and even those we encounter only briefly as we go about our lives, buying things, going to events or gatherings, and trying to carve out a life that has some meaning and purpose to it. We know the truth inside ourselves when we've let God down or when we've disappointed those we love the most. It's not the words of judgment that drew me to examine this chapter. What drew me to it were the words of hope. Words of hope like those spoken by Dr. King when he said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." God calls us to big things, to hard work that takes courage and persistence. We don't have to address thousands of people like Dr. King, or spread prophecy like Isaiah so far and wide that it's been read billions of times. But if we call ourselves Christians, we have intertwined our lives with God's call to create a world that will require us to step out beyond what we can even imagine. And that's why we need prophets. It's why we need our own prophetic voices. It's why we have to listen carefully in all directions outside of the places we normally gather the news of the day, because it's only there that we'll hear the voices that are completely uncredentialed and without pedigree. We are not accustomed to listening to those voices. It makes us uncomfortable, sometimes in the extreme. But I believe it is the words of the prophets that will lead us to that place where justice prevails, where the exploited and oppressed are freed, and where we actually care for our neighbors as if they were part of our own family. You want to know why I think we read "do not be afraid" in the Bible 70-something times? Because we have the words of the prophets, those of old and those who speak today. We don't have to worry about what lies ahead because we have prophets to guide us. Still, I can't help but wonder what it would really look like if sexual trafficking was ended, or if we canceled the debts of every college student. And I really don't care about people who would say to me, "That's impossible, Amy, you can't do that." It's a radical thought, I get it. But when I read the words of the prophet Isaiah, or listen to Dr. King say, there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but he must take it because conscience tells him it is right. It makes me want to do things differently than the way I've been doing them. There is good news amid all these uncomfortable places, and Isaiah offers it clearly. I'll give you a full life in the emptiest places. Or in the NRSV translation, the words are, satisfy your needs in parched places. I wonder where your empty places are, where your life is dry as a bone. Is it in the work that you do? Have you lost your way there, become disconnected from the inspiration or passion which first drew you to it? Is your empty place waking up in the morning unsure of how you'll fill another long day? Is your empty place that you're uncertain if the skills you have will be adequate for what you're called to do? Or is your empty place that you feel alone even when you're surrounded by people? The good news is that as painful as parts of this life can be, there is beauty and great care in the words of the prophets. Your shadowed lives will be bathed in sunlight. You'll be like a well-watered garden, a gurgling spring that never runs dry. You'll use the old rubble of past lives to build anew, rebuild the foundations from out of your past. You'll be known as those who can fix anything. And finally, I will always show you where to go. We needed to hear the whole chapter from Isaiah today because to read only the beginning would leave us contemplating the judgment without hearing the good news. Sunlight, guidance on the road ahead, and a fullness in your empty places. That sounds like a way forward to me.